There are streets in Britain so old that the stones beneath your feet have been worn smooth by 1,000 years of forgotten footsteps. Streets that have seen plague carts, public hangings, midnight whispers, and secrets buried so deep they never fully surfaced. Tonight, we walk slowly through the most famous medieval streets of Britain, not through their grandeur, but through their darker, quieter past. There is no need to hurry here. These streets have been waiting for centuries, patient and unchanged beneath their ancient stones. Let your body settle now, and let the quiet cobblestones of Britain's past carry your thoughts gently towards sleep. Close your eyes and imagine the smell of wood smoke, damp stone, and river water drifting through a narrow medieval alley. These streets were never clean, never safe, and never truly quiet. Even in the deep of night, something was always moving. Tonight's story walks slowly through the darker side of Britain's most ancient streets, the executions, the plague, the poverty, and the shadows between the lantern lights. Nothing here will startle you, only the slow, patient weight of old history, settling gently into the quiet of the night. Let your breathing slow now, and allow these ancient, cobbled streets to carry you softly into sleep. There are streets in Britain so old that the stones beneath your feet have been worn smooth by 1,000 years of forgotten footsteps. Streets that have seen plague carts, public hangings, midnight whispers, and secrets buried so deep they never fully surfaced. Tonight, we walk slowly through the most famous medieval streets of Britain, not through their grandeur, but through their darker, quieter past. There is no need to hurry here. These streets have been waiting for centuries, patient and unchanged beneath their ancient stones. Let your body settle now, and let the quiet cobblestones of Britain's past carry your thoughts gently towards sleep. Close your eyes and imagine the smell of wood smoke, damp stone, and river water drifting through a narrow medieval alley. These streets were never clean, never safe, and never truly quiet. Even in the deep of night, something was always moving. Tonight's story walks slowly through the darker side of Britain's most ancient streets, the executions, the plague, the poverty, and the shadows between the lantern lights. Nothing here will startle you, only the slow, patient weight of old history, settling gently into the quiet of the night. Let your breathing slow now, and allow these ancient, cobbled streets to carry you softly into sleep. The buildings that lean over the Shambles today date largely from the 15th and 16th centuries. Their upper floors were deliberately built to overhang the street below, maximizing floor space in an overcrowded city. This overhang created a perpetual twilight at street level even on the brightest days, a narrow corridor of perpetual shadow. In winter, the overhanging buildings trapped cold air and damp below, making the street a dark and bitterly cold tunnel. In summer, they trapped the heat and smell of the butcher stalls beneath, making the air almost unbearably thick. One of the darkest aspects of medieval butchery on the Shambles was the disposal of waste. Offal, bones, blood, and unusable carcass parts were simply discarded into the street or the river nearby. Rats and carrion birds were permanent residents, drawn by the constant supply of discarded meat and bone. The smell alone was something that medieval visitors to York frequently noted in their written accounts. Yet despite all of this, the Shambles remained one of the busiest and most essential streets in the entire city. Tucked quietly into the Shambles is a small shrine dedicated to St. Margaret Clitheroe. She was a York butcher's wife who lived on this very street in the 16th century. She secretly converted to Catholicism during a time when practicing the faith was a capital offense in England. Discovered hiding Catholic priests within her home, she was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. Her execution in 1586 was one of the darkest events ever to take place within sight of this ancient street. Margaret Clitheroe refused to enter a plea at her trial. She would not allow those who knew her to testify against her. Under English law at the time, refusing to plead meant automatic sentencing without a full trial. Her sentence was to be pressed to death beneath heavy stones, a method known as peine forte et dure. She was taken to a bridge over the river Ouse, laid upon the ground, and weighted down until she died. She was later canonized by the Catholic Church, her memory preserved quietly in this small street that knew her footsteps. As the centuries passed, the butchers of the Shambles gradually gave way to other trades. By the 19th century, the street had fallen into poverty and disrepair, its once busy stalls abandoned. The blood channels and the cobblestones grew dark with age, the overhanging buildings sagging under their own weight. It was a street the wealthier residents of York preferred to avoid, a reminder of a medieval past the city was trying to forget. Only in the 20th century did the Shambles begin its transformation into the preserved historic street we know today. York was historically one of England's most significant sites of public execution. The city's central location in the north made it the seat of royal justice for the entire northern region. Public hangings took place regularly at the city's gates and in its open squares. These were not quiet events. They were attended by enormous crowds, treated as public spectacles and civic occasions. The streets leading to the execution sites, including the Shambles, would have been lined with onlookers every time. York's famous city walls enclosed a population living under constant threat of violence and political upheaval. The Wars of the Roses, the long conflict between the royal houses of York and Lancaster, tore through this city repeatedly. York, as the seat of the House of York, bore particular significance in this brutal dynastic struggle. Soldiers, spies, and political prisoners moved constantly through these streets during the long decades of conflict. The walls that still stand today absorbed much of that violence, their stones witnesses to a century of quiet terror. Of all the disasters to strike medieval York, the Black Death of 1349 remains the most devastating. The plague arrived in York after sweeping through the south of England with extraordinary speed. Within months, it is estimated that between a third and half of York's entire population had died. The streets fell silent in ways they had never been silent before. Whole families gone, whole neighborhoods emptied. The Shambles itself was left with gaps where the butcher families had been, their stalls standing empty, their stories ended abruptly. The city's churchyards filled so quickly during the plague that new burial grounds had to be established outside the walls. Bodies were often buried in mass graves, wrapped in simple cloth, with few of the customary funeral rites observed. The priests who administered last rites died themselves in alarming numbers, leaving many to die without any comfort. The psychological weight of this loss on those who survived was something medieval accounts struggle to fully describe. York took generations to recover, and even then, the memory of those empty streets never fully left the city. The churches of York played a central role in the daily life of the Shambles and its residents. The Church of St. Crux stood at one end of the street, its presence watching over the butchers and their trade. Medieval butchers were expected to tithe a portion of their profits to the church and to contribute to masses for the dead. The connection between slaughter, sacrifice, and spiritual redemption was deeply embedded in medieval consciousness. The church bells that rang out over the Shambles each morning were as much a part of the street's identity as its meat stalls. Not all of the darker history of the Shambles is written in public records or official accounts. Like every medieval street, it had its unofficial economy, its thieves, its fences of stolen goods, its moneylenders. The narrow courts and passages leading off the Shambles provided cover for transactions that preferred the dark. Medieval York had a permanent criminal underclass, operating just beneath the surface of the city's official life. These were the people who left no names in the records, only the occasional glimpse in a court document or a coroner's note. Fire was one of the greatest recurring threats to any medieval street built in timber and thatch. The overhanging buildings of the Shambles were particularly vulnerable. Once one building caught, the fire could leap the narrow gap to the other side in moments. Medieval York suffered several significant fires across its long history, each one erasing parts of the city's older layers. Buckets of water, leather fire hoses, and demolition of buildings in the fire's path were the only tools available. The fear of fire was so constant that many residents slept with their clothes on, ready to flee into the dark street at a moment's notice. Despite all of its hardship and darkness, the Shambles was also a place of extraordinary daily resilience. Every morning, before the rest of the city fully woke, the butchers of the Shambles were already at their work. Animals had been brought in the night before, slaughtered in the early hours, and prepared for the day's trade. The street came alive before dawn, a quiet, purposeful activity that had its own rhythm, its own ancient routine. This daily resilience, repeated across centuries, is perhaps the truest history of the Shambles, not its darkness alone, but its stubborn, patient continuation. As we leave the Shambles and walk further into Britain's medieval past, let the street settle gently into the dark behind you. Its stones are still there tonight, as they were 700 years ago, worn smooth by all those forgotten footsteps. The overhanging buildings still lean toward each other in the same patient way, the same narrow strip of sky still visible above. Nothing about this place is in any hurry. It has waited this long, and it will wait longer still. Let its quiet, ancient patience drift over you now, as we move slowly on to the next street in our story. York's medieval heart contains more to explore than any single night could hold. Its streets layer upon layer of dark history. But for now, the city grows quiet around us, and the next street waits ahead in the dark. Let your breathing slow a little more with each step along these ancient cobblestones. You are walking through history that most people will never slow down enough to truly feel. Let it settle over you now, patient and unhurried, as we continue deeper into Britain's medieval past. Steep Hill in Lincoln is exactly what its name suggests, a sharp, cobblestone climb rising from the lower city to the ancient hilltop. This street has been in continuous use since Roman times, making it one of the oldest functioning streets in Britain. At its top sits Lincoln Cathedral, one of the most impressive medieval buildings in all of Europe. But the street below the cathedral holds a darker history than its beautiful destination would suggest. Tonight, we climb slowly, step by careful step, through the centuries that haunt this ancient hill. In the medieval period, Steep Hill was Lincoln's primary commercial artery connecting the lower city to the wealthy hilltop. Merchants, clergy, pilgrims, and criminals all used this same narrow climb, their paths crossing in the tight passage. The gradient made it a natural bottleneck. Goods carried by cart would sometimes slip and crash, scattering their contents across the stones. In winter, the cobblestones became dangerously icy, and accidents on this hill were a common feature of medieval Lincoln's life. Several medieval coroners' records from Lincoln note deaths attributed to falls on this very street during cold weather. Among Steep Hill's most significant and tragic histories is its connection to Lincoln's medieval Jewish community. In the 12th and 13th centuries, Lincoln's Jews were among the most prosperous in England, their homes concentrated near Steep Hill. Two surviving medieval buildings on Steep Hill, known as the Jews' House and the Jews' Court, still stand today. They are among the oldest continuously standing domestic buildings in England, their stones quietly outlasting the community that built them. But the fate of Lincoln's Jewish population is one of the darkest chapters in the city's long and complicated history. In 1190, a wave of anti-Jewish violence swept across England in the months following the coronation of King Richard I. Mobs attacked Jewish communities in several English cities, London, York, and Lincoln among them. In York, the massacre at Clifford's Tower remains one of the most tragic events in English medieval history. Lincoln's Jewish community survived 1190, but they lived for the following century under constant pressure, suspicion, and legal restriction. The houses that still stand on Steep Hill are silent witnesses to a community that endured far more than most history books describe. In 1255, Lincoln became the center of one of medieval England's most notorious blood libel cases. The body of a young boy named Hugh was found in a well, and local Jewish residents were accused of ritual murder. The accusation had no basis in fact. It drew on a deeply anti-Semitic myth that had already caused violence across Europe. 19 Lincoln Jews were hanged in London following trials that were grotesquely unjust even by the standards of the time. The child Hugh was venerated as a martyr in Lincoln Cathedral for centuries, a memorial built upon a terrible and murderous lie. In 1290, King Edward I issued the Edict of Expulsion, ordering every Jewish person in England to leave the country. The Jewish community of Lincoln, which had lived on and near Steep Hill for over 2 centuries, was gone almost overnight. Their homes, their synagogue, and their community structures were confiscated, repurposed, or simply left to decay. The Jews' house on Steep Hill passed into other hands, its original owners scattered into an uncertain exile across Europe. It would be more than 350 years before Jewish people were officially permitted to return to England. Lincoln Cathedral itself carries several darker chapters within its long and imposing history. The original Norman cathedral was partially destroyed by an earthquake in 1185, an event so unusual in England that it was recorded with considerable alarm. Reconstruction took decades, drawing on enormous amounts of forced labor from the surrounding countryside. The medieval peasants who quarried, transported, and laid the stone that built this enormous building are entirely unnamed in the historical record. Their labor built one of the most celebrated buildings in England. Their names are as completely lost as the medieval streets below them. The construction of great medieval cathedrals like Lincoln's was an achievement of extraordinary human endurance. Thousands of workers, many of them effectively forced by feudal obligation, spent decades on these vast building projects. Accidents were frequent and often fatal, with records noting workers crushed by falling stone or killed by scaffolding failures. The medieval church recorded the donations of wealthy patrons with careful precision, but rarely the deaths of the anonymous builders. Every carved stone in Lincoln's cathedral was placed by hands whose owners history chose not to remember. Below the cathedral, Steep Hill continued its daily life through plague, war, and political upheaval across the centuries. The Black Death struck Lincoln with particular violence in 1349. The city lost a significant portion of its population within months. The steep gradient of the hill made it difficult to remove the dead quickly during the epidemic's worst weeks. Bodies were sometimes left in houses for days before anyone came to collect them, a measure of just how overwhelmed the city had become. The survivors who climbed this hill in those months did so in a city that had been fundamentally and permanently altered. Lincoln was also a significant site during the English Civil War of the 17th century. The city changed hands between royalist and parliamentary forces multiple times between 1642 and 1644. At the area around Steep Hill, lying between the lower city and the cathedral hilltop, saw direct military conflict. Buildings were damaged, looted, and in some cases deliberately demolished to improve defensive positions. The medieval fabric of Lincoln absorbed yet another violent chapter, its stones scarred but still standing. Lincoln Castle, visible from the top of Steep Hill, contains one of the most remarkable prison histories in England. The castle's Victorian prison, built within its medieval walls, operated a system of strict solitary confinement. Prisoners were confined to individual cells, forced to wear masks when outside them, and prohibited from speaking to anyone. The system was believed at the time to encourage reflection and rehabilitation. In practice, it caused widespread psychological breakdown. The medieval walls that surrounded this Victorian cruelty had seen centuries of imprisonment before, their stones long accustomed to confinement. Lincoln Castle holds one of only 4 surviving original copies of Magna Carta, sealed in 1215. This document, forced from King John by his barons, established for the first time that even a king was subject to the law. Its journey to Lincoln was the result of the city's strategic importance during the political upheaval of the early 13th century. The same streets that saw Jewish persecution, plague, and civil war also witnessed this foundational moment in legal history. History, as Steep Hill demonstrates, rarely arrives in simple or comfortable forms. It layers its light and darkness together. As dawn light begins to touch the top of Steep Hill each morning, the cathedral catches it first. For centuries, this was the first thing the people of Lincoln saw at sunrise, the great stone towers glowing before the rest of the city woke. Below, the street would gradually fill with the same ancient sounds: merchants, pilgrims, animals, and the slow creak of carts on cobblestone. The contrast between the cathedral's grandeur and the daily struggle of the street beneath it was always present, always felt. It is a contrast that still exists today, if you walk the hill slowly enough to feel it. The Jew's house still stands on Steep Hill, its Norman arch and stone walls unchanged in their essential form for 800 years. It has been a private residence, a shop, a restaurant, each new occupant unaware, perhaps, of the full weight of the building's history. The family who built it is unknown by name. Their fate after 1290 is unknown. Their lives within these walls are unrecorded. Yet the building remains, stubbornly, quietly, impossibly present, one of the oldest domestic structures in England. There is something deeply moving about standing before a building that has outlasted every attempt history has made to erase it. As we leave Steep Hill behind, let the darkness of the lower city settle gently around us once more. The cathedral continues to watch from the hilltop, as it has watched for 900 years. The cobblestones of the hill remain as they were, worn, patient, and indifferent to the centuries passing over them. Let the weight of all that history rest gently now, like the fog that rolls up from the lower city on a quiet night. We move on, deeper into Britain's medieval streets, as your own thoughts grow softer and quieter still. The rows of Chester are unlike any other medieval street system in Britain, perhaps in the world. They consist of a continuous covered gallery running along the first floor of the buildings, with shops below at street level and more shops opening off the gallery above. No one knows precisely why this extraordinary arrangement developed. Theories range from Roman remains beneath the streets to deliberate medieval planning. Walking the rows today is to walk through something genuinely unique, a medieval street experience that has survived largely intact. But beneath the picturesque black and white timber fronts, Chester's rows carry a darker and more complicated past. Chester, known in Roman times as Deva Victrix, was one of the most important Roman military fortresses in Britain. The Romans built their city on a grid, and the streets of medieval Chester largely followed those ancient Roman lines. As the Roman buildings collapsed and were gradually buried, medieval builders constructed directly on top of the rubble. The raised level of the rows may be a direct consequence of this layering. New buildings built atop the ruins of old ones. Chester is, in this sense, a city built upon itself, layer after layer of habitation pressing down through the centuries. In medieval Chester, a curfew bell was rung each evening to signal that the city's gates were closing and citizens should be indoors. After the curfew bell, the streets of Chester belonged officially to the night watchman and unofficially to those who preferred the dark. Thieves, prostitutes, and those conducting business that could not bear daylight moved through Chester's covered rows after curfew. The covered gallery of the rows provided particular shelter for those who wished to avoid the open street. The same architectural feature that made Chester's shopping galleries charming also made them ideal for concealment. Chester's position on the border with Wales made it a city in a state of near-constant military tension throughout the medieval period. The Welsh and English fought repeatedly across Chester's surrounding landscape, and the city itself was never far from the threat of siege. In 1399, the city's close association with the deposed King Richard II made it a target for Lancastrian retribution. The economic consequences of the city's repeated military involvement pressed down hardest on those at the bottom: the traders, the servants, the poor. The rows that hosted Chester's commerce also absorbed the economic shocks of each new conflict. Chester held an unusual legal status in medieval England. It was a county palatine, meaning its earl held near-royal powers within its borders. This meant that Chester operated its own courts, its own laws, and its own system of justice, largely independent of the crown. Those who fell foul of the earl's justice had little recourse to the wider legal system that might, occasionally, offer more protection. Records from Chester's medieval courts describe cases of extraordinary cruelty handed down by local officials with almost unlimited power. The impressive facades of the rows masked a legal system that could be brutal in its efficiency. Chester's East Gate, North Gate, West Gate, and Bridge Gate controlled every movement in and out of the medieval city. The North Gate, in particular, held a dark reputation. It contained the city's main prison, embedded directly within the gatehouse. Prisoners held in the Northgate jail described conditions of extraordinary squalor: no light, little air, and chronic overcrowding. Many prisoners died in the Northgate before ever coming to trial, from disease, from cold, or from the violence of other prisoners. The gateway through which Chester's medieval residents passed daily contained within it a permanent population of the forgotten. Executions in Chester took place just outside the city walls, within sight of the Northgate that had held the condemned. Hanging was the most common sentence for crimes ranging from theft to murder, with little distinction between the two in severity. The bodies of the executed were sometimes left to hang for days as a visible warning to those passing through the city gate. Chester's position as a regional center meant that executions drew visitors from the surrounding countryside. Grim entertainment, in an era of few alternatives. The stones of the North Gate that still stand today were familiar with the sounds and silences of these occasions. The covered galleries of the Rose were also, in later medieval centuries, associated with Chester's mystery plays. These elaborate dramatic performances, drawn from biblical stories, were performed by the city's trade guilds on the streets and on wagons. They were simultaneously religious instruction, civic entertainment, and community bonding, and they were performed in the same streets that hosted the city's markets, courts, and dark commerce. The sacred and the profane existed side by side in Chester's covered galleries with a naturalness that the modern world finds difficult to picture. A guild performing a nativity scene on one section of the Rose while a debt was being collected by force in the gallery above was not an unusual combination. The River Dee runs along Chester's southern flank, its waters crucial to the city's medieval trade and industry. Goods arriving by water were unloaded at Chester's quays and carried up through the city to the Rose and its markets. The river also served less pleasant purposes. It was the city's primary drain, its water carrying away the waste of a densely packed medieval population. Outbreaks of waterborne disease were a regular feature of Chester's life, their causes entirely misunderstood until centuries later. The dark water of the Dee that moves so quietly past the city walls too. The Black Death reached Chester in 1349, spreading through the city's densely packed streets with terrible efficiency. The covered galleries of the Rose, normally a busy commercial space, fell silent as trade collapsed and people retreated from contact. The city's records show that a significant number of Chester's clergy, those responsible for administering to the dying, died themselves during the epidemic. The administrative collapse that followed left many of the city's poorest residents without any official support or structure. Chester recovered slowly, not merely economically, but psychologically, the communal trauma of the plague visible in the city's records for decades afterward. The English Civil War brought Chester one of its most prolonged episodes of suffering, a siege that lasted over a year. Parliamentary forces surrounded Chester in 1644 and maintained their siege through the winter of 1645 and into 1646. The city's population, cut off from supply lines, faced starvation as the siege continued through the winter months. The Rose that had provided Chester's commercial identity for centuries became sites of desperation and rationing. When the city finally surrendered in February 1646, it was not through military defeat, but through the simple exhaustion of its food supply. The Chester that emerged from the Civil War siege was a diminished and broken place. The population had been significantly reduced, the trade networks disrupted, and the physical fabric of the city damaged. The Rose themselves survived structurally, but the community that had animated them for centuries needed years to rebuild. Slowly, across the second half of the 17th century, Chester's commercial life returned to its galleries. The same ancient stones that had witnessed the city's darkest months were once again walking paths for traders and customers. Today, walking Chester's Rose is to walk through a remarkably preserved medieval commercial landscape. The black and white timber frontages that define the street's appearance largely date from Victorian reconstruction, enthusiastic restoration of the medieval ideal. But the structure beneath, the stone undercrofts, the Roman foundations, the medieval gallery layout, is genuinely ancient. Chester's Rose are a street system that has been continuously inhabited, traded in, and lived beside for 2,000 years. Every footstep in that covered gallery follows in the path of Roman soldiers, medieval merchants, plague survivors, and Civil War refugees. Chester Cathedral, whose origins date to a Saxon monastery of the 11th century, watches over the Rose from its quiet close. Its nave and cloisters absorbed centuries of prayer, music, and the particular grief of a city that endured repeatedly. The cathedral's medieval choir stalls, intricately carved with human and animal figures, include many images of daily life, including scenes of suffering and hardship. The craftsmen who carved them were carving their own world, its humor, its cruelty, and its quiet, enduring faith. These carvings watch over the cathedral's silence tonight as they have for 6 centuries, still, patient, and untouched by the darkness outside. As we leave the Rose behind and move on through Britain's medieval streets, let Chester settle gently into the dark. The gallery is empty now. No merchants, no pilgrims, No Civil War survivors pulling their coats against the winter cold. Only the stone and timber remain, breathing quietly in the night air, waiting patiently for morning as they always have. Let your own breathing slow to match that same quiet patience, the same unhurried darkness that settles over Chester each night. We continue on, deeper into the night and deeper into Britain's medieval past, as your thoughts grow quieter still. Vicar's Close in Wells, Somerset, is said to be the oldest continuously inhabited medieval street in Europe. Built in the mid-14th century, its identical stone houses stretch in two parallel rows toward the cathedral, unchanged in their essential form for nearly 700 years. It was built to house the vicar's choral, the men responsible for singing the cathedral's daily services. From the outside, it appears peaceful, even perfect, a complete medieval street preserved in amber. But within its quiet uniformity lies a history of confinement, control, and institutional darkness. The vicar's choral who lived in Vicar's Close were not free men in any meaningful sense of the word. They were required to sleep in their houses each night, to attend every service in the cathedral, and to seek permission to leave the close. The chain across the close entrance, still present today, was not merely symbolic. It marked the boundary of their permitted world. To live in Vicar's Close was to live within an institution that controlled your hours, your movements, and your relationships. The beautiful, uniform street was, in many ways, a gilded cage, comfortable enough, but a cage nonetheless. Each house in Vicar's Close was small, a single room on each floor, a narrow staircase, a small garden at the back. The men who lived here were educated clerics, yet their domestic conditions were modest to the point of austerity. In winter, the stone walls would have held the cold with particular efficiency, making the small fireplaces the center of any warmth. They lived, ate, and slept within earshot of each other, a community built on proximity and the complete absence of privacy. The particular psychological difficulty of that arrangement is one that no medieval record describes, perhaps because there was no language for it. Wells Cathedral, at the end of Vicar's Close, is one of the earliest completely Gothic buildings in England. Its famous scissor arches, an engineering solution to a structural problem discovered after construction began, have become one of the most recognizable sights in English ecclesiastical architecture. But the cathedral that appears so serene today was an institution of considerable power and occasional cruelty. The ecclesiastical courts that operated from the cathedral had jurisdiction over a wide range of offenses, from sexual misconduct to heresy. Those who fell foul of the church's justice in medieval Somerset had few places to appeal beyond the institution that had condemned them. The crime of heresy, challenging the established doctrines of the Catholic Church, was punished with extraordinary severity in medieval England. Wells and its surrounding region were not immune to the religious tensions that eventually led to the Reformation. Lawless heretics, followers of the reformer John Wycliffe, were active in Somerset from the late 14th century. Several local lawlads were tried in the church courts, forced to publicly renounce their beliefs, and in some cases burned at the stake. The serene stone houses of Vicar's Close looked out on a world where religious belief could lead directly to death. The Black Death struck Wells in 1348 and 1349 with the same devastating efficiency it demonstrated everywhere in England. The cathedral chapter, the administrative body that included the vicar's choral, lost a significant portion of its members. The very community that Vicar's Close was designed to house was nearly wiped out within months of the epidemic reaching Somerset. The close that was built for community singing fell largely silent, the voices that animated it gone, the houses standing empty. It took decades for the vicar's choral to rebuild their numbers and restore the musical life that the close existed to support. The surrounding Somerset countryside from which Wells drew its population was itself a landscape of considerable hardship. Medieval peasant farming in Somerset was perpetually vulnerable to flooding. The Somerset levels, low and wet, flooded regularly. Failed harvests and flood years pushed rural families into acute starvation, with little relief available beyond the charity of the church. Those who made their way into Wells seeking food or work found a city that could offer limited assistance to an almost unlimited need. The cathedral's charity was real but constrained. It could not absorb the suffering of an entire flooded countryside on its own. The chain that still closes Vicar's Close each night is one of the most quietly evocative details of any street in Britain. Hung across the entrance each evening, it marked the moment when the street ceased to be a public space and became an institutional one. No casual visitor, no night wanderer, no criminal or desperate person could cross that chain without permission. The close within was a separate world, regulated, ordered, and utterly distinct from the medieval town outside its entrance. Yet within that regulated world, the full range of human difficulty, loneliness, illness, resentment, and grief continued quietly regardless. The famous scissor arches of Wells Cathedral were installed in the 14th century after the central tower began to sink under its own weight. The solution, two stone arches crossed in a scissor pattern, transferred the load sideways and saved the tower from collapse. The engineering was remarkable for its time, a creative and effective response to a structural crisis unfolding over decades. The craftsmen who conceived and built this solution worked without any of the mathematical tools that modern engineers take for granted. They built by observation, by experience, and by a kind of structural intuition that centuries of medieval building had slowly accumulated. The market at Wells was one of the most important commercial events in medieval Somerset. Granted by royal charter, the market drew traders and buyers from across the region on a weekly basis. The space between the cathedral and the town was animated by the noise, smell, and complexity of medieval commerce. Arguments over prices, disputes about weights and measures, accusations of theft, all were regular features of market day. The cathedral close, where the vicar's choral lived their regulated lives, sat directly adjacent to all of this noise and commerce. Winter in Vicar's Close must have been a particular test of the community's patience and endurance. The stone houses, however solidly built, held heat poorly against the cold of a Somerset winter. The cathedral services continued regardless of weather or season. The vicar's choral were required to attend whatever the conditions. Walking from the close to the cathedral in the dark of a January morning, across a frost-covered courtyard, was a daily reality of this life. The beauty of the medieval routine and the physical hardship of living it existed in constant, unacknowledged tension. Each morning in Vicar's Close, the small stone houses would open in sequence as the vicars prepared for the first service of the day. They would emerge into the close, walk together down its length, and pass through into the cathedral beyond. This daily procession, the same route, the same destination, the same sequence, was repeated without significant variation for centuries. It is a ritual so ordinary that no one thought to record it in detail, yet it is precisely this ordinariness that makes it moving. Somewhere in that daily procession is the texture of medieval life, not in its drama, but in its quiet, determined continuation. Vicar's Close survived the Reformation, unusual for a medieval institution so closely tied to the Catholic liturgy. When Henry VIII broke with Rome, the vicars' choral adapted, their role continuing in the new Church of England framework. What had been Catholic plainchant became Protestant liturgy. The voices changed their words, but the houses remained the same. In the centuries following the Reformation, Vicar's Close became gradually less restrictive, its residents gaining more freedom of movement. But the chain remains, a daily reminder of the centuries when this beautiful street was a world unto itself. As we leave Vicar's Close behind, let its particular quiet settle over you for a moment longer. It is a street that has known more of the same than almost anywhere else in Britain. The same houses, the same pathway, the same cathedral at the end. There is something in that sameness that is deeply restful. The knowledge that this place has been continued, carefully, for 7 centuries. Let that continuity settle gently over your own thoughts now, your own breathing growing slower and more even. We move on again, through the dark of Britain's medieval past, toward the final streets of tonight's long, quiet story. Beyond the Shambles, York holds within its ancient walls a network of medieval streets and passages that few visitors ever explore fully. Gudramgate is one of the oldest streets in York, its name derived from a Danish personal name, Guthrum, preserved from the Viking occupation of the city. The Vikings who gave this street its name were here for nearly a century, transforming York into one of Northern Europe's most important trading cities. Their presence left deep marks on York's streets, its language, and its legal system. marks that persist in the names and layouts of streets still walked today. Tonight, we move through this Viking-named street and into York's darker, narrower passages, its Snickelways, where the medieval city hides most. The Vikings who settled York, calling it Jorvik, arrived in 866 and remained for nearly a century. Their city was prosperous, cosmopolitan, and in many ways more sophisticated than the Anglo-Saxon settlements they displaced. Archaeological excavations beneath York's modern streets have revealed Viking-age houses, tools, food remains, and human burials in extraordinary detail. The same layers of soil that preserve their lives also preserve evidence of the violence of their arrival: burned timbers, abandoned possessions. Every street in medieval York walks over the Viking city, which itself walks over the Roman fortress below. The Snickelways of York are a network of narrow passages, alleys, and shortcuts winding through the medieval city. Some are barely wide enough for a single person to walk through. Ancient right-of-way routes preserved through centuries of development. They were used by medieval residents as practical shortcuts between the city's major streets, and by those who preferred to move unseen. Thieves, servants, priests, and lovers all moved through York's Snickelways, the hidden capillaries of the medieval city. Tonight, we walk slowly through these passages, the city's official history left on the wider streets behind us. Mad Alice Lane is one of York's most atmospheric Snickelways, a narrow passage named after a woman hanged for insanity in the 19th century. Alice Smith was tried and executed for what the court described as a crime committed in a state of mental instability. The execution of the mentally ill was not an unusual feature of the English legal system until relatively recently. That the lane now carries her name is a small act of historical remembrance, imperfect but persistent. Walking through Mad Alice Lane at night, its high walls pressing close, is to walk in a place that remembers something most official history would prefer to forget. Many of York's Snickelways offer sudden and unexpected views of the minster between their high walls. These glimpses of the cathedral, framed by the narrow passage on either side, were equally available to medieval residents. The minster was the most expensive, most visible, and most politically charged building project in York's medieval history. Its construction consumed enormous amounts of money, labor, and political energy across 3 centuries. The ordinary residents of York's Snickelways lived their lives in the shadow of this vast institutional project, largely uninvited inside. York's medieval streets had their permanent population of destitute residents, those for whom the city offered no path to stability. Begging was regulated by the city authorities, with certain areas officially permitted and others restricted. The narrow passages and covered entries of the city's Snickelways offered shelter and a degree of invisibility to those who needed both. Medieval York's official records largely ignore this population. They appear only when they died, when they were arrested, or when they caused a problem for someone with a name. The Snickelways they sheltered in still exist, their stones unchanged, though the people they housed are completely nameless. York's Night Watch was responsible for patrolling the city's streets after the curfew bell had rung. They were not a professional police force in any modern sense. They were local men serving a civic obligation, poorly paid and often poorly equipped. Their authority was real but limited. They could arrest, they could challenge, but the dark city always held more than they could manage. The Snickelways that provided shortcuts for ordinary residents during the day were navigation challenges for night watchmen trying to maintain any kind of order. The medieval city after curfew was a place that looked after itself in ways the official record rarely acknowledges. Rain in York's Snickelways creates a particular atmosphere that the medieval residents would have found entirely familiar. The narrow passages channeled rainwater downhill in fast-moving streams across their cobblestones. In heavy rain, moving through the Snickelways meant wet feet, slick cobblestones underfoot, and walls that ran with water. Medieval York had no drainage system beyond the slope of its streets and the flow of the rivers at its edges. To live in medieval York was to be in regular, unavoidable physical contact with the city's weather in ways that modern buildings have largely ended. One of Guthramgate's most interesting medieval survivals is Our Lady's Row, a terrace of small houses dating from 1316, built to generate income for the chantry chapel that funded prayers for the dead. These houses represent an unusual form of medieval commercial real estate. The priests who received this rental income used it to pay for masses, a transactional arrangement between commerce and spiritual obligation. The tenants who lived in Our Lady's Row were ordinary York residents, their rents funding prayers they may never have known were being said on their behalf. The houses still stand on Gudramgate, the oldest surviving example of a row of houses in England. During York's plague years, the marking of infected houses was one of the most feared aspects of the epidemic's management. A house where plague had appeared would be marked, and its occupants effectively imprisoned within it, cut off from any outside contact. Food might be left at the door by those brave enough to approach, but the family inside was otherwise entirely alone. The psychological experience of being sealed inside a narrow York house, listening to the street outside grow quieter each day, is something no medieval document describes fully. Yet those marked doors were a feature of York streets during each successive epidemic, a visible announcement of death's latest address. The condemned in York were transported through the city's streets to their execution in a formal procession. This journey passed through the main streets of the city, visible to as many residents as possible. The spectacle was part of the punishment. The condemned were sometimes offered food and drink along the route, a final meal consumed in motion, in public. York's snickleways would have been used by those wishing to move quickly to a good vantage point, or by those wishing to avoid the procession entirely. The same narrow passages that hosted ordinary daily life also hosted this darker theater of medieval justice. As midnight approaches in tonight's slow walk through York, the city's walls become the most present feature of the landscape. Built, rebuilt, and maintained across Roman, Viking, Norman, and English periods, they represent the accumulated defensive anxiety of 2,000 years. Walking the walls at night, as night watchmen did for centuries, the city below appears as a dark and complicated mass of rooftops and passages. From above, the snickleways are invisible. The city presents only its wider streets and its church towers to the sky. Only at ground level, only by walking slowly through the narrow passages, does the city's true, complicated self become apparent. York Minster contains within it the largest medieval stained glass window in England, the Great East Window. This window, completed in the early 15th century, depicts the beginning and end of the world as medieval theology understood it. Its creation required decades of work by a single master glazier and his workshop, an investment of human skill across an entire lifetime. The medieval congregation that looked up at this window did so in a dark interior, the glass illuminated from outside by whatever light the York sky provided. On a gray York day, the window would have appeared muted and subtle. On a sunny afternoon, it would have seemed almost supernatural. The deepest and narrowest of York's snickleways in full darkness are among the most atmospheric places in England. High walls on either side reduce the visible sky to a thin strip of stars above. The cobblestones beneath are uneven, worn into dips and ridges by 800 years of footsteps. Standing still in such a place, the sounds of the modern city disappear. There is only the occasional drip of water on stone. This is as close as any living person can come to standing in the medieval city as it actually was: dark, narrow, damp, and extraordinarily present. Tonight's long walk through York streets has covered only a small part of what the medieval city contained. Every street, every passage, every worn stone doorstep holds within it a version of the same layered, complicated history. Violence and beauty, poverty and grandeur, confinement and freedom, all existing within the same narrow medieval geography. This is the true texture of the medieval street. Not a single story, but hundreds of them, all occurring simultaneously in the same small space. Let that richness settle gently into your thoughts as your own awareness of the present world grows softer. As dawn begins to touch the top of York's highest walls, the snickleways below are still in complete darkness. The light arrives in these narrow places later than anywhere else in the city. They are the last to wake each morning. For medieval residents, this delay in daylight was simply the nature of their street, a feature of the geography they navigated every day. The gradual transition from darkness to gray to pale morning light in a narrow York passage is one of the quietest, beautiful things the city offers. Let that quiet transition from dark to light move slowly through your own thoughts now. as tonight's walk begins to draw toward its end. York at dawn has always looked something like this. The church towers lit first, the streets below still dark and quiet. The minster, tallest of all, catches the earliest light, its pale stone briefly golden before the city fully wakes. The residents of the Shambles, of Goodramgate, of the Snickleways, all would have known this same particular sight. The continuity of that morning view, across centuries, is one of the most quietly moving things about an ancient city. Let it rest gently in your thoughts now. A city that has watched the dawn arrive 10,000 times, patient and unchanged. As we leave York behind for the final time tonight, let the city's long, complicated history settle gently around you. The Shambles, Goodramgate, the Snickleways, all are quiet now, their stones dark and still in the night. Tomorrow the tourists will come, and the streets will fill again with the sounds of a living city. But tonight they belong to their own silence, the same silence they have known for 1,000 years between the footsteps. Let that silence accompany you now, as we move toward the quiet conclusion of tonight's long and patient story. The streets we have walked tonight are only a small fraction of what medieval Britain contained. Thousands of similar streets, some surviving, many lost, threaded through every town and city across the island. Each one carried within it the same mixture of ordinary life and extraordinary darkness that we have followed tonight. None of these streets existed in isolation. They were connected, interdependent, part of a vast and complicated living system. That system is gone now, but its ghost remains, most clearly visible in the streets that have survived it. The cobblestones that survive from medieval Britain are among the most direct connections we have to the people who lived there. They were worn into their current shapes by feet that are gone, thousands upon thousands of ordinary journeys. Every dip in an ancient cobblestone is a record of all the weight that has passed across it. To walk on medieval cobblestones is to place your own weight into a groove made by countless anonymous lives before yours. It is one of the quietest and most profound forms of connection that history offers. The light that medieval residents of these streets lived by was an entirely different kind of light from any we know today. Tallow candles, oil lanterns, and open fires provided everything. Their light warm, yellow, and unable to penetrate more than a few feet of darkness. The darkness beyond the reach of a medieval candle was real and complete in ways that modern artificial light has entirely abolished. To understand medieval street life is to understand first what that darkness felt like, how present and how normal it was. The darkness we move through tonight, in the imagination of these ancient streets, is only a pale reflection of the one they actually knew. Many of the people who moved through Britain's medieval streets left no trace in any written record. Their names, their faces, their fears, and their small joys are entirely lost, absorbed into the silence that time makes of all ordinary lives. Yet they were there, in numbers far greater than any record suggests, filling these streets with the noise and warmth of living. Every quiet street we have walked tonight was, in its medieval life, loud, crowded, smelly, and deeply, irreducibly human. The silence we imagine now is ours. The streets themselves never chose it. The medieval street experience was profoundly different in each season in ways that modern infrastructure has largely eliminated. Summer brought heat and smell to the narrow passages, the accumulated waste and animal presence of a medieval street in full warmth. Autumn brought rain and mud, cobblestones slick, gutters overwhelmed, the narrow streets running with water. Winter brought frost and darkness, ice on the stones, the cold pressing through every gap in timber frame buildings. Spring brought some relief, but also flooding, as winter's accumulated moisture found its way through the streets at last. For the vast majority of medieval street residents, the world beyond their immediate neighborhood was largely theoretical. Most people in medieval Britain lived and died within a few miles of their birthplace. The streets they knew were not representative of a wider world. They were the entire world, or nearly so. Every event that happened on those streets, a fire, a death, a festival, an arrest, was enormously significant in a way that modern urban life rarely allows. The intensity of medieval street life came partly from how small and complete each street's world was unto itself. As the medieval market day ended and stalls were packed away, the street underwent a daily transformation. The noise and commerce of the day gave way to a quieter, more cautious evening life. Shutters were closed, doors barred, and the street that had been the center of community life became a place to avoid. This daily rhythm, the noise of commerce giving way to the caution of night, was repeated across every medieval street in Britain. The street was never simply a street. It was a place that changed its character completely between daylight and dark. Fog in a medieval street was not merely atmospheric. It was a genuine hazard and a genuine fear. In thick fog, the familiar landmarks of a known street became unreliable, and the darkness within the fog was total. Medieval accounts describe the fear of fog with particular intensity. It erased the street's normal geography and replaced it with uncertainty. The people who moved through medieval Britain's foggy streets did so by memory and by the feel of the cobblestones beneath their feet. In some sense, we navigate these same streets tonight in much the same way, by memory, by imagination, and by feel. The darkness of a medieval town at midnight was something that the modern world cannot fully replicate or entirely imagine. No street lighting, no light pollution from surrounding areas, no electric glow behind shutters, only what fire could provide. The stars would have been visible in a medieval night sky in ways they no longer are in any English town. The medieval experience of night was both more frightening and more beautiful than anything available to us today. This darkness, absolute, star-filled, and entirely natural, settled over Britain's medieval streets every single night, patient and unchanged. Looking up from a medieval street at midnight, the sky would have appeared full in a way that is now almost impossible to experience. The Milky Way, clearly visible, would have stretched across the darkness directly above the narrow strip of street. Medieval residents would have known the stars with a familiarity that most modern people have lost. They were navigation, calendar, and companion. Every night, these streets passed beneath the same enormous, indifferent sky that passes above us now. Let that sky rest above your own thoughts tonight. Vast, quiet, and entirely unconcerned with the small and important details of human life below. The churches of medieval Britain's streets served functions that no single modern institution provides. They were community centers, hospitals, legal courts, libraries, and concert halls, as well as places of worship. Their bells regulated the day, marking hours, announcing events, calling the community together for both celebration and mourning. The silence between the bells was itself a kind of structure, the space within which the medieval day was organized. Tonight, that silence is unbroken. The bells have been still for hours, and the street is finally, completely at rest. There comes a point in every medieval night when the last candle is extinguished and the street falls completely dark. This moment, the transition from the last light to total darkness, was experienced nightly by every medieval resident. The sounds that remained in that darkness were the sounds of the street itself: wind, water, the occasional creak of timber. In a world without artificial light, this darkness was not frightening so much as simply the nature of the night. Let this same natural darkness settle over your own thoughts now, the last candle flickering, then quietly gone. As tonight's long walk through Britain's medieval streets draws toward its end, let the fog settle gently over everything. Let the Shambles, Steep Hill, the Rose, Vicar's Close, and York's Snickleways all soften slowly into the mist. Their cobblestones are still there beneath the fog, patient and unchanged, as they will be when the mist clears in the morning. But for now, let them rest in the soft blur of tonight's ending, no longer needing your full attention. Only the quiet remains now, the quiet that settles over ancient streets once the story is done. Somewhere in medieval Britain, on a night very much like this one, someone was sitting by just such a candle. They were thinking thoughts we will never know, carrying concerns that history swallowed entirely. Their street was quiet around them, the same cobblestones dark, the same walls holding the cold. They would not have imagined that anyone, centuries later, would spend a quiet night thinking about the street they lived on. And yet, here we are, connected across time by nothing more than stone and patience and the quiet of the night. The people who made Britain's medieval streets what they were have left behind almost nothing of themselves. No photographs, no recordings, no detailed self-portraits. only occasional names and records that note them briefly and move on. Yet they were there, fully present, fully human, in every moment that those streets contained. Their absence from the historical record is not a measure of their unimportance, only of the record's limitations. Tonight we have walked in the spaces they occupied, and that is a kind of remembering that the record cannot provide. From a great and imagined height, medieval Britain at night was a dark island scattered with small, warm lights. Each light marked a community of people engaged in the full complexity of human life, its love and its violence, its faith and its doubt. From this distance, none of the darkness we have explored tonight is visible. Only the warmth of the lights remains. Both things are true simultaneously, the darkness and the light, the cruelty and the endurance. Medieval Britain, like every human place and time, contained them both, inseparably, all at once. The cobblestones are the last thing we see as tonight's walk ends, just the stones in the quiet moonlight. They ask for nothing, no interpretation, no emotional response, no particular thought. They are simply there, as they have been for centuries, worn smooth by all the lives that crossed them. Let your own thoughts become as simple and unhurried as these stones tonight, present, patient, and at rest. There is nothing left to understand, nothing left to follow. Only the quiet of the ancient street, settling over you at last. The last lantern in tonight's long walk through Britain's medieval streets is almost out. Its light has been enough to see by, enough to follow the story through its darkest passages. Now it dims, gently, the way all lights dim when their time is quietly done. Let your own awareness dim alongside it, softly, without resistance, without any effort at all. Sleep comes the way lanterns go out in empty medieval streets, gradually, naturally, and without any final drama. The streets are completely dark now, their stories done for tonight. The cobblestones lie quiet beneath the stars, as they have lain through every night of the 7 centuries since they were laid. Nothing moves, not the street, not the buildings, not the long, slow history that fills them both. There is only the dark and the quiet and the patient, unhurried presence of old stone in the night. Let this quiet be yours now, completely, without effort or thought, just the dark and the stillness and sleep arriving at last. And so, tonight's long, slow walk through Britain's most famous medieval streets comes quietly to its end. We have walked through blood and stone, through plague and faith, through the ordinary and the terrible, all of it carried in cobblestones and timber and the patient walls of ancient buildings. The streets are still there tonight, as they were when we began, unchanged and unhurried, waiting for tomorrow. Let that thought rest with you now, that these places endure, that the stones remember, that the dark between the lanterns is not empty but full. Good night, and sleep peacefully within the long, quiet, and enduring story of Britain's ancient streets.